This chart really puts it in perspective here, looking at total Chinese investments in ports. Beijing, of course, is investing not just in Sri Lanka, around the Asian region, far beyond that. Actually, Tanzania tops the list here, Australia, Guinea, and then Sri Lanka in fourth place here, $3.9 billion invested so far. Hambantota, of course, that's probably the best-known port example. It's been sort of criticised by many for being a debt trap. Others would disagree, but certainly Chinese investments in Sri Lanka, not just that focus on ports, because you take a look at this map here and we can see investments in infrastructure, transport, even cultural as well, taking a look at some of the value of those. So the larger circles representing north of $1 billion, medium around $500 million, and the smaller ones $0.25 billion. But certainly these are projects that were committed to be delivered between 2000 and 2021. This is taking a look at data from Aid Data Research Lab at the College of William and Mary in Virginia, Yvonne.
Yeah, and China's foreign infrastructure investments have raised concerns over security risks in the Asia-Pacific and beyond. For more, let's bring in Mohid Iftikhar, lecturer in Comparative Public Administration at Lingnan University in Hong Kong. Mohid, it's great to have you. First and foremost, maybe we could take a step back and talk a little bit more about what really led to this sort of rise of China's dominance in these ports.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. So we have to look at the background. Initially, the port investments in Sri Lanka, Hambantota, they were not a part of the Belt and Road. If you look really on ground, this investment translated back in 2006 and 2007. And initially, this port investment was pitched to, I believe, other regional and outside powers, India and the U.S., but at that time, nobody was willing to invest in Sri Lanka. It was largely because of the ethnic conflict that was happening since '83 to 2009. So Sri Lanka was a really bad place, and the government and their public spending on infrastructure was less than 6.5%. So at that point of time, it made perfect sense for China to come in. So per se, this investment was prior to the Belt and Road. Yeah.
What led, though, China to invest in it? Because there are a number of feasibility studies looking at Hambantota in particular that said this was not a good project to proceed with, especially at that sort of scale. So why do you think China then agreed to pass over the funds when the likes of India, for instance, were not willing to stump up any cash?
So in places where there's high risk, such as Sri Lanka at that point of time in the mid-2000s, because of the security situation, nobody was willing to invest. And any investment that is made, there are a lot of there are a series of meetings that happened before. So it was Sri Lanka that pitched the idea. It was not China. It was Sri Lanka, and it was under the government of the former president Rajapaksa, and it was at that point of time it was his infrastructure spree, because he wanted to bring in, and largely was also part of his election manifesto as well for that political survival. Yeah.
To what extent do you think these ports are becoming geopolitical assets?
So with economic objectives largely come geopolitical objectives as well, meaning you have to secure your trade networks. If you have companies there, you want to also add value to those the supply chain networks. So per se, geopolitics not necessarily means military dominance. It also means controlling essential trade lines, the critical supply of materials. So this is what it means. Not entirely per se.
Not really like building military and naval bases, for example.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Even though, I mean, sort of the counter-argument to that, I guess, is even if China's being driven by economics, the amount of leverage it has in Sri Lanka now means that its infrastructure assets, like that port in particular, could be used for military purposes.
So there are two things now. One is normal military diplomacy, where naval ships go to different ports, they make port calls, which is a normal part of military diplomacy. But at the same time, you have to look on ground the other Chinese investments in Sri Lanka, some of that you were discussing earlier, for instance, roads and highways. Because of Chinese investments in Sri Lanka, their road and highway networks have increased at least 60 to 70%. Same for energy sector. Also, they have that famous monumental building, the Lotus Tower. So per se, it's not military, but it can be military diplomacy, but it doesn't mean the same thing as projecting power. So it means normal visits to ports.
Some of the consequences of this dominance that we're seeing in China in some of these nations like Sri Lanka is this complaint of death traps, and that some of these ambitious projects don't quite materialize the way that they're initially proposed. You're saying those are not fair arguments. Why not?
I do, because you have to look on ground at domestic political economy of different states, because it is the domestic political economy where Chinese investments have to navigate. It's the bureaucracy, it's the political leaders. So once you sign agreements on paper, they have to navigate that complex black box. For instance, the former leader, when they signed the agreements, it was basically his cabinet members, part of his close network. But when of these investments started to translate, there was a lot of intervention in bureaucracy. Take this Hambantota port. It's in the home constituency of Raja Pakas. So it makes that sense that we also have to explore that domestic political economy, the bureaucracy, how it functions. So we cannot entirely put the blame on China over here.
What do you think, though, it happens now? Because, of course, we've got a new government in place. They're looking to scrutinise all of these investments from China, other places as well. But what do you think the outlook is now then?
So I think for the incumbent president-elect, he has to navigate a lot of domestic political and economic realities. One is, of course, the IMF. And in terms of IMF, this is the first time you have a leader, as your former colleague, as your colleague Dan mentioned, that has not happened before. So Sri Lanka started to liberalize back in the late 1970s, and now he has negotiated the IMF as well in terms of state organizations. But there's a lot of speculation. So one argument that I'm also looking at is how would Sri Lanka respond to the BRICS as well? So minus the speculation, so there should be some type of a balance. But it's too early to say what would be his foreign policy response.
What's going to be the response from the U.S., even Southeast Asia, even allies like Japan? I mean, do they have the political will to be sort of these alternative funding options as a counterweight to China?
That's a good question. So back in 2013, when the Belt and Road initially came in, I guess for the U.S. and allies and institutions such as the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, there was a sense of realization that there's a major infrastructure gap in Asia. I think it is 1.7 trillion at that point of time annually. So how do we accommodate that? So Belt and Road made perfect sense, and it was also part of the failure on these agencies that they cannot provide. And in many ways, the Belt and Road does not compete, instead complement these international donors. Yeah.